April 13, 1943. The morning air above Rabaul hung thick with tropical humidity as Petty Officer Second Class Takeshi Yamada adjusted the frequency dial on his Type 97 radio transmitter inside the communications bunker. Outside, palm trees swayed gently in the warm breeze, their fronds casting dappled shadows across the crushed coral pathways that connected the sprawling Japanese military complex. Yamada had been awake for nearly 20 hours, his eyes burning from strain, his fingers cramped from the constant tapping of Morse code keys. He had no way of knowing that within the next few minutes, a single transmission error would set in motion one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the entire Pacific conflict. The men in that bunker believed their coded messages were completely unbreakable, their confidence bolstered by years of successful encrypted communications that had coordinated victories across thousands of miles of ocean. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 5 days would demonstrate how one moment of human exhaustion, combined with extraordinary cryptographic achievement and split-second tactical decisions, could alter the trajectory of an entire theater of operations. This is the story of how an accidental radio transmission exposed the most closely guarded secret in the Japanese military hierarchy, and how a team of American codebreakers, pilots, and commanders transformed that mistake into a mission that changed everything. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we must first understand the man at the center of it all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was not merely a military commander. He was the architect of Japanese naval strategy in the Pacific. Born in 1884 in Nagaoka, Japan, Yamamoto had lost 2 fingers on his left hand during the decisive naval encounter at Tsushima in 1905, a physical reminder of his decades of service. He had studied at Harvard University, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and developed an intimate understanding of American industrial capacity that filled him with both admiration and dread. Yamamoto had opposed going to conflict with the United States, famously warning his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no expectation of success. His prediction proved grimly accurate. By April 1943, the tide had definitively turned. The Japanese had suffered catastrophic losses at Midway the previous June, losing 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced aviators. Guadalcanal had fallen after months of brutal attrition that cost Japan irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. The Solomons campaign was grinding down Japanese air power at an unsustainable rate. Yamamoto understood these realities better than anyone. He had conceived Operation Y-Go, a massive aerial offensive designed to regain air superiority over the Solomon Islands. Beginning on April 7th, waves of Japanese aircraft had struck Allied positions at Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and New Guinea. The operation involved over 350 aircraft, the largest concentration of Japanese air power since the Pearl Harbor operation. Yamamoto had personally traveled to Rabaul to oversee the offensive, demonstrating his commitment to reversing Japanese fortunes through decisive action. The results, however, had been disappointing. Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced replacements for the veterans lost at Midway and Guadalcanal, returned with wildly inflated claims of success. They reported sinking numerous Allied vessels and downing scores of aircraft. Yamamoto's staff celebrated what appeared to be a tremendous victory. In reality, American losses were minimal: a destroyer, a tanker, a corvette, and perhaps 25 aircraft. The disconnect between reported and actual results reflected a growing problem within Japanese military culture, a reluctance to deliver bad news up the chain of command. Buoyed by these false reports, Yamamoto decided to personally visit forward bases in the Solomon Islands to congratulate the pilots and boost morale. It was exactly the kind of leadership gesture that had earned him devotion from his men throughout his career. His staff planned a one-day inspection tour for April 18th, with stops at Balal Island and Buin on the southern tip of Bougainville. The Admiral would depart Rabaul at 6 in the morning, flying in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the aircraft Americans called the Betty, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. This is where Takeshi Yamada enters our story. The young radio operator had been assigned to encode and transmit the detailed itinerary to the bases Yamamoto would visit. The message contained precise information, departure time, arrival times at each location, the number and types of aircraft involved, and the Admiral's complete schedule down to the minute. It was classified at the highest level, intended only for the commanders at Balal and Buin who needed to prepare for the Admiral's arrival. Yamada was exhausted. The communications center at Rabaul operated around the clock, processing hundreds of messages daily. The pace of operations during Operation Waigo had been relentless. That night, April 13th, Yamada made a decision that seemed insignificant at the time but would have enormous consequences. Rather than using the most secure cipher reserved for messages of the highest sensitivity, he transmitted the itinerary using the standard naval code, JN-25D, as American cryptanalysts designated it. It was a subtle distinction, one that might have gone unnoticed in the chaos of wartime communications. But it made all the difference. The lower-level code was one that American codebreakers had been working on for months, and Yamada, whether through fatigue, haste, or simple oversight, had just handed them the key to an unprecedented opportunity. 7,000 miles away, in an unmarked building in Washington, D.C., the message was intercepted within hours. The Navy's cryptanalysis organization, known as OP-20G, worked in shifts around the clock, processing the flood of intercepted Japanese communications. The operation employed over 2,000 people, from mathematicians to linguists to IBM punch card machine operators. They worked in conditions of intense secrecy. Even most of the Navy's senior commanders had no idea the organization existed. The breakthrough in Japanese naval codes had come more than a year earlier, when cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort in Hawaii had cracked enough of the JN-25 code to predict the Japanese attack on Midway. That intelligence coup had enabled the American victory that turned the tide of the Pacific conflict. Since then, the codebreakers had continued refining their abilities, building a more complete picture of Japanese naval operations with each intercepted message. When Yamada's transmission arrived at OP-20G, it was initially processed like any other intercept. Our team of analysts began working through the coded groups, using the code books and cipher keys they had painstakingly reconstructed. Within hours, the meaning began to emerge. The analysts recognized several key elements: high-ranking officer, specific times, specific locations. As more of the message resolved into plain text, the significance became clear. Lieutenant Commander Alva Laswell, one of the Navy's most gifted cryptanalysts, was working at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific in Hawaii when a partially decoded version of the message arrived from Washington. Laswell had been instrumental in the Midway intelligence victory, and he immediately recognized the importance of what he was seeing. But there was a problem. Several critical portions of the message remained unclear, including the identity of the officer making the inspection tour. Laswell worked through the night, applying his deep knowledge of Japanese naval terminology and communication patterns. He knew that Japanese officers were often referred to by their commands rather than their names. The message referenced the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. There was only one person that could be. By the morning of April 14th, Laswell had completed his translation. The message read in part, "On 18 April, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet will visit Balal, Shortland, and Buin in accordance with the following schedule." It then laid out Yamamoto's complete itinerary, including the 6 aircraft escort and the type of aircraft he would be flying in. It was an intelligence windfall of almost unimaginable value. The translation was immediately flagged for the highest levels of command. Within hours, it reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, at his headquarters in Hawaii. Nimitz was a thoughtful, measured leader who understood both the opportunity and the risks presented by this intelligence. An operation against Yamamoto could eliminate Japan's most capable naval strategist and deliver a severe blow to Japanese morale. But it could also compromise the secret of American code-breaking, a secret more valuable than any single mission. Nimitz consulted with his staff and intelligence officers. The question was not whether they could intercept Yamamoto. That appeared feasible given the geography and available forces. The question was whether they should. If the mission succeeded, the Japanese would certainly investigate how the Americans had known where to find their admiral. If they concluded that their codes were compromised, they would change them. And the intelligence advantage that had proven so decisive at Midway would be lost. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox was consulted, as was President Franklin Roosevelt himself. The decision was made at the highest level. The opportunity was too significant to pass up. Yamamoto was not just a military commander, he was a symbol. His elimination would resonate throughout Japan and signal that no one was beyond American reach. The mission was authorized. Now came the practical challenges. Yamamoto would be flying over Japanese-controlled territory, far from any American bases. The only aircraft with sufficient range to intercept him were the Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, more than 400 miles from the intercept point. Even with external fuel tanks, it would be the longest fighter intercept mission ever attempted. The task fell to the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 13th Air Force, commanded by Major John Mitchell. Mitchell was a skilled pilot and meticulous planner who understood that the mission's success would depend on precise navigation and split-second timing. Yamamoto's itinerary was detailed down to the minute. If the American fighters arrived too early, they would be spotted and the Admiral's plane would turn back. Too late, and they would miss him entirely. Mitchell plotted a course that would take the fighters on a circuitous route, staying low over the water, to avoid detection by Japanese radar and coast watchers. The route covered more than 400 miles and required navigation by dead reckoning alone. No radio communication that might alert the Japanese. The pilots would need to maintain precise headings and airspeeds for more than 2 hours, then arrive at exactly the right place at exactly the right time to intercept an aircraft traveling at more than 200 miles per hour. On the night of April 17th, Mitchell briefed his pilots on the mission. 18 P-38s would participate, divided into 2 groups. The killer flight of 4 aircraft would attack Yamamoto's bomber directly. The remaining 14 would fly top cover, protecting the killer flight from the escorting Zeros. The 4 pilots assigned to the killer flight were Captain Thomas Lanphier, Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. Mitchell explained the route, the timing, and the absolute necessity of radio silence. He told them their target was a high-ranking officer, but did not reveal it was Yamamoto. That information was too sensitive to risk. The pilots understood the mission's importance from the elaborate precautions and the presence of senior officers at the briefing. They spent the evening checking their aircraft and trying to rest, knowing they would launch before dawn. At 7:10 on the morning of April 18th, the P-38s roared down Henderson Field's runway and climbed into the morning sky. Almost immediately, problems arose. Lieutenant Holmes discovered that his drop tanks were not feeding properly. He would have to abort. His wingman, Lieutenant Hine, stayed with him as briefed. The killer flight was now down to just 2 aircraft, Lanphier and Barber. The remaining 16 fighters settled into formation and turned northwest, beginning the long over-water leg that would take them around the Japanese-held islands. They flew at barely 50 feet above the waves, so low that salt spray misted their canopies. The pilots maintained strict radio silence, navigating by compass and clock, trusting Mitchell's calculations. For more than 2 hours they flew through empty sky, seeing nothing but ocean below and clouds above. The tension was extraordinary. Any error in navigation, any unexpected headwind or course deviation would mean failure. The pilots scanned their instruments constantly, made minute adjustments to their headings, and watched their fuel gauges with growing concern. At 9:34, right on schedule, the coast of Bougainville appeared on the horizon. Mitchell felt a surge of relief. His navigation had been perfect. The fighters began their climb to intercept altitude, shedding their drop tanks as they rose. The killer flight, now just Lanphier and Barber, accelerated ahead, scanning the sky for their target. At precisely 9:35, Lanphier spotted them, 2 Betty bombers descending toward the Bouin airfield, escorted by 6 Zeros, flying in 2 groups of 3. Yamamoto was exactly where the codebreakers had said he would be, exactly when they said he would be there. The intercept was perfect. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Lanphier called out the sighting, and the P-38s accelerated to attack. The Zero escorts, caught by surprise, scrambled to respond. Lanphier climbed toward the fighters, while Barber dove for the bombers. The Americans had the crucial advantages of surprise and altitude. The Zeros were below them and out of position. Barber closed on the lead Betty bomber from behind and below. He pressed the trigger, and his 450 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon erupted, sending streams of rounds into the bomber's right engine and fuselage. The Betty, notorious for its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, immediately began to burn. Barber saw pieces flying off the aircraft and dense smoke pouring from the right engine. The stricken bomber descended rapidly toward the jungle below. Barber pulled up to avoid debris and saw the second Betty diving toward the water, apparently trying to escape. He pursued it, firing again. This aircraft also began trailing smoke and eventually made a controlled landing in the water near the coast. Its passengers, including Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, survived, though seriously injured. The first bomber, carrying Yamamoto, crashed into the jungle canopy and exploded on impact. There were no survivors. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The American fighters, their mission complete, turned south and raced for home, the Zeros in pursuit. Lieutenant Hine, who had caught up with the formation after resolving his fuel problems, was hit and went down. He was the mission's only American casualty. Lanphier and Barber would later dispute who actually shot down Yamamoto's aircraft, a controversy that was never fully resolved and caused lingering bitterness between the two men. But the mission's success was undeniable. The Americans had flown more than 400 miles over enemy territory, intercepted their target with split-second precision, and eliminated the most important naval commander in the Japanese military. On the Japanese side, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. Search parties reached the crash site the next day and found Yamamoto's body still strapped into his seat, thrown clear of the burning wreckage. He had been struck by rounds that ended his life almost instantly. The searchers noted that he was still wearing his white dress gloves, gripping the hilt of his ceremonial sword, the image of a commander preparing to meet his men. The Japanese military kept Yamamoto's passing secret for more than a month. Unable to process the shock and unwilling to deliver such devastating news to the Japanese public. When the announcement finally came on May 21st, the nation went into mourning. Yamamoto had been one of the most respected figures in Japan, admired even by many who opposed the conflict he had been forced to execute. His state funeral was the largest in Japanese history, attended by over 1 million mourners. The impact on Japanese military morale was severe and lasting. Yamamoto had been an irreplaceable figure, a strategic thinker who understood the global dimensions of the conflict, who commanded respect from his subordinates and fear from his enemies. His successors were capable officers, but none possessed his combination of vision, experience, and prestige. The combined fleet would never again display the same level of strategic initiative. Back at Rabaul, the communications staff faced a grim reckoning. The Japanese military launched an investigation into how the Americans had known where to find the admiral. The inquiry examined every aspect of the operation, looking for security breaches. Suspicion fell on coast watchers, spies, and traitors. But the most obvious explanation, that their codes had been broken, was rejected. The Japanese had too much faith in the complexity of their encryption systems to believe such a breach was possible. Petty Officer Yamada was questioned along with everyone else involved in planning the inspection tour. He told his interrogators everything he knew, including his decision to use the standard naval code rather than the highest security cipher. The investigators noted this detail, but did not see it as significant. After all, the Americans could not possibly be reading their encrypted communications. They concluded that the intercept must have been the result of some other intelligence failure, perhaps a spy in their midst or a lucky guess based on observed patterns. This failure of imagination saved the American code-breaking secret. The Japanese continued using their compromised codes for the remainder of the conflict, and American cryptanalysts continued reading their most sensitive communications. The intelligence advantage that had proven so decisive at Midway, and that had made the Yamamoto mission possible, remained intact. The Americans, for their part, took elaborate precautions to protect the secret. They created a cover story suggesting that coast watchers in the Solomon Islands had spotted Yamamoto's aircraft and reported its location by radio. This explanation was plausible enough that the Japanese could not dismiss it. The pilots who flew the mission were cautioned never to discuss the intelligence that made it possible. Commander Alva Laswell continued his work in cryptanalysis, contributing to numerous intelligence successes over the following 2 years. He received little public recognition during his lifetime. The secrecy surrounding code-breaking operations was too important. Only decades later, when the secrets of the Pacific cryptanalysis effort were finally declassified, did the full extent of his contribution become known. Major John Mitchell completed his combat tour and returned to the United States, where he served as an instructor and staff officer. He was credited with the navigation and planning that made the mission possible, and he received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. His careful calculations, made with nothing more than maps, charts, and a steady hand, had brought 16 fighters to exactly the right point in space at exactly the right moment. Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber both received the Navy Cross for their roles in the mission, and both claimed credit for the decisive shot. The controversy damaged their friendship and occupied historians for decades. Modern analysis, including reconstruction of the flight paths and bullet trajectories, suggests that Barber was most likely the pilot who struck Yamamoto's aircraft, but the question may never be resolved with certainty. Both men served with distinction through the remainder of the conflict. The broader significance of the mission extended far beyond the elimination of one commander. It demonstrated that American intelligence capabilities had reached a level of sophistication that could track and target specific individuals across vast distances. It showed that American military forces had the skill and daring to execute precision operations in the most challenging circumstances. And it sent a message to Japanese military leaders that no one was safe, that American reach extended into their most secure spaces. For the Japanese military, the loss of Yamamoto accelerated trends that were already underway. Decision-making became more cautious and reactive. Strategic initiative passed definitively to the Americans. The institutional knowledge and prestige that Yamamoto had embodied could not be replaced. His successors fought bravely and sometimes skillfully, but they were managing a losing position that he had predicted before the first shot was fired. The story of Takeshi Yamada reminds us that great events often turn on small moments. A tired young man, trying to process one more message at the end of a long shift, made a decision that seemed trivial at the time. He used a slightly less secure code, saved himself a few minutes of work, and went on with his duties. He had no way of knowing that thousands of miles away, teams of mathematicians and linguists were waiting for exactly that opportunity. The lesson is not about blame or carelessness. Yamada was one of thousands of radio operators, processing countless messages every day, under conditions of extreme stress and fatigue. He followed procedures that had always been adequate before. The lesson is about the cumulative nature of intelligence work, how thousands of hours of patient, unglamorous effort can be vindicated in a single moment when opportunity and preparation align. The codebreakers who made the Yamamoto mission possible never fired a weapon or flew an aircraft. They worked in basement offices, hunched over worksheets covered with letter groups, testing hypotheses and eliminating possibilities until meaning emerged from apparent randomness. Their contribution to the conflict was invisible, but decisive. They gave commanders the ability to see through the fog of war, to know where the enemy would be and what he planned to do. That knowledge saved countless lives and shortened the conflict by months or years. There is something poignant about the image of Yamamoto in his final moments, dressed in his best uniform, wearing white gloves, gripping his sword, flying to congratulate young pilots who had performed far less well than they believed. He was a man of considerable personal honor, trapped in a strategic situation he had accurately foreseen and tried to prevent. He understood American industrial capacity better than almost anyone in Japan's leadership, and he knew what that capacity meant for Japan's prospects in a prolonged conflict. In the end, he was undone not by American industrial might, but by American intellectual achievement. The codebreakers had built a machine every bit as formidable as the aircraft factories and shipyards, a machine that processed information instead of metal, that produced understanding instead of weapons. It was precisely the kind of resource that Yamamoto, with his Harvard education and Washington experience, might have appreciated better than most. The Yamamoto mission also illustrates the moral complexity of targeted operations. The decision to authorize the mission was made at the highest levels of American government, after careful consideration of both the benefits and the risks. There was no doubt that it was legal under the laws of armed conflict. Yamamoto was a combatant in a command position, but there was something cold and calculating about the precision with which it was executed, the way intelligence was converted into action with mechanical efficiency. Yet the alternatives were not more humane. Every day the conflict continued, men were lost on both sides. If eliminating Yamamoto shortened the conflict even slightly, if it reduced Japanese will to fight or degraded their strategic decision-making, then the lives saved would far exceed the lives lost. These calculations are impossible to make with certainty, but they shape the thinking of the commanders who authorized the mission. 70 years later, we can see the Yamamoto mission as a turning point in how nations conduct conflict. The combination of signals intelligence, precision navigation, and long-range strike demonstrated a model that would become increasingly dominant in subsequent decades. The ability to find and target specific individuals, to project force across vast distances with surgical precision, emerged from the experience of the Pacific conflict and has only grown more sophisticated since. The story also speaks to the enduring importance of human judgment in the age of technological warfare. Machines intercepted the radio signal, but humans recognized its significance. Computers helped with some of the cryptanalysis, but human minds supplied the insight and intuition that completed the picture. Pilots flew the aircraft, but human hands guided them through that precise 2-hour navigation. Technology enabled the mission, but human skill and courage executed it. Perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us that conflicts are won not just by strength, but by knowledge. The nation that understands its enemy better, his intentions, his capabilities, his vulnerabilities, holds an advantage that cannot be offset by numbers or courage alone. The investment that the United States made in signals intelligence and cryptanalysis during the Second World Conflict paid dividends that are difficult to overstate. It was one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the 20th century. For Petty Officer Takeshi Yamada, the remainder of the conflict passed without distinction. He continued his duties at Rabaul until the base was bypassed and neutralized by American forces, then evacuated to Japan, where he survived the remaining months. He never knew that his small error had changed history, never understood that one transmission had set in motion a chain of events that eliminated his nation's greatest naval strategist. He lived out his days in post-war Japan, one of millions of ordinary people who had played their small parts in the vast machinery of conflict without ever seeing the larger picture. The machinery of intelligence analysis continued its work long after the Yamamoto mission, reading Japanese communications until the final days of the conflict. It provided warnings of kamikaze attacks, enabled the submarine campaign that strangled Japanese supply lines, and contributed to countless tactical and strategic decisions. The secret was kept until decades after the conflict ended, when the cryptanalysts finally received the recognition they deserved. Today, visitors to the crash site on Bougainville can still find pieces of Yamamoto's aircraft scattered through the jungle. The wing section where his body was found is marked by a small memorial. The jungle has reclaimed most of the site, as it eventually reclaims everything in that climate. But the memory endures, of a commander who foresaw his nation's defeat and was unable to prevent it, and of the moment when a single transmission error sealed his fate. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.